Bora. Bora fazer uns braços. Tem vários dias que eu fiz. Passei a semana na barraca lá também, né? Tava com uns braços doloridos, umas coisas. Tava jogando um Pokémon e dormi tarde sem dar, então atrasou o rolê. Acabou ali meu whey. Pai tá pedal. Mas tem um tempo de dar um descanso aqui nos músculos. Bora ver então como é que vai. Como é que vai ser antes que eu vou dormir, que eu tô com sono já. Só esperando terminar de processar uma porra ali.
Okay, how should a terrain editor work? Well, in The Sims, have you ever tried to create a hill and then try to make it a little lower again? Or a planet coaster? Or SimCity? Or City Skylines? Or Roller Coaster Tycoon? It doesn't really matter what game you pick. You're not in full control and you often end up doing not exactly what you had in mind. But there's one game that has, in my opinion, solved it. Let me show you. I've sung my love for Tiny Play before and I'll do it again. It's strictly speaking not a simulation game, but it's definitely a software toy, like the Sapling is a software toy. But their approach to basically everything is so radically different than how most simulation games do it. It's a true eye-opener for me. To edit terrain, what you do is you first draw an area, which the game then remembers as one entity. This entity you can drag up or down, and you can also change the slope. And if you later decide you want it a little higher, or you do not want it at all, no problem. As I've explained in Devlog Season 2, Episode 1, the terrain editor so far was based on random noise, which you can control with one seed, one number. The terrain editors in most simulation games do the other extreme and store the height of each individual vertex. By making a unit of elevation the mountain,
Vai sempre,
the
8 desse,
system finds the
4
perfect
vezes,
between these two approaches.
4, 7 de 8. E então, umas puxadas aqui.
High level enough to make it easy to use, unlike your average simulation game. So when a player draws, I store the location where they draw, the size of the tool at that moment, and I also store a value that represents the slope of the mountain. In my first version, when building the 3D model for a player-created world, each of the 20,000 vertices on the map checked the distance to every mountain to see whether it was inside the circle. This was quick to implement and showed that this approach could work, but of course, the more you drew, the slower the system became because the list of checks to be done when rebuilding the world grew with 20,000 every time you drew something. Now, the game caches which vertices are affected by the mountain, so I can get rid of the costly distance calculations entirely and I iterate over the mountains instead. The result is a tool that in most situations feels buttery smooth. But it still can't keep up if you move your cursor really fast. I guess the true solution here is if the cursor is here on one frame and here on the other, the game should assume it made this movement, but that's polish for another time. Until then, you'll get a nice archipelago. Now the mountains have been defined, or I guess they're continents in my game, you can select them and change them by moving your cursor. In Tiny Glade, you do all of this with the same tool, which is elegant but also slightly limiting, because it means you cannot draw a mountain on top of a mountain, or at least not without pressing keys of your keyboard. They also use the same tool to delete the mountain again, simply by dragging the height all the way to 0. Again, elegant but also limiting, because you cannot make holes. When creating a planet, however, first drawing a continent and then a mountain range on top of this continent is quite a natural thing to do, as is lowering the ocean floor to create deep sea. Therefore, I am using separate tools, one for drawing, one for deleting, and one for modifying, which can either be changing the slope or changing the height. As a quick side note, I've also received some suggestions to allow the import of grayscale height maps. Let me know whether you would be interested in such a thing. One major advantage would be that you could work with maps created in other tools, or even games, like one of my personal favorites, Terra Firma by solo developer Garrett Robinson, which allows for the simulation of wind and water erosion. By the way, Terra Firma 2 is coming out at the end of October. Anyway, being able to change the terrain height also created the requirement that the player need to be able to see the map from other perspectives in the planet editor. This by itself was already a struggle to get right, but it also broke the code that translates the cursor position to the coordinates on the terrain. So far, in the Planet Editor, I did this by figuring out where the corners of the map were on your screen and then check the position of the cursor relative to those corners. Now, instead, I shoot away from the camera to see where it hits the terrain, which is slightly more expensive in terms of performance, but it works however the camera is rotating. As you can hear, I've also added sound effects to the new map editor. By combining recordings of avalanches, earthquakes, or just people dragging heavy rocks, I've made a different sound for each occasion. In most cases, the main reason to add sound effects is just what game developers call juice, meaning it makes the UI feel better because you get direct feedback on your actions. In this case though, the sounds
Vai bom pra se levantar pouquinho ali, velho. Minha foto só lixo depois do começo. Por enquanto eu 100% consegui fazer, depois eu vou melhorando.
Now, with a separate sound for each of them, the tool is intuitive without a single word of text. While working on these tools, I realized that this was also a good opportunity to redo the volcano feature. Many players have mentioned that the volcanoes looked almost as if they were separate objects pasted on the land, which is indeed exactly what they were. Every time the volcano erupted, I made the land around it a little higher, and this was mainly to make volcanic islands possible, but it unfortunately also meant that volcanoes became more and more hidden inside a weird-looking mountain. As of this update, they will start as small hills with a hole. You can now see why the ability to create holes on top of mountains was so important to me. And this hill will grow with each eruption. What I have to give up with this approach, unfortunately, is the ability to see the lava flow as some sort of progress bar for the event. Now the volcano can have any shape, I can no longer model something static by hand like before. I guess the only way to achieve this would be some sort of fluid simulation, which I'd say is too much for this update.
Anyway, so we've discussed the draw button, the modify button, the delete button, and the volcano button. But there's still one button left, and this button does what people continue to ask me. Before I explain though, as the season is ending, let me quickly say a few closing words on the update. The most important thing, it's almost there. Also, as always, I will slightly increase the price on November the 1st, so if you already know you want to buy the game, you better do it now. And speaking about buying stuff when it's cheap, until November the 1st, everything in my merch store will be 10% off if you use the promo code MOVEMENT.
On November 1 week from now, the first version will upload on the beta branch. This is how you get access to it. As always, it will be a buggy mess at first, but I will bombard it with bug fix patches in the first few weeks until it doesn't crash all the time anymore. And once the worst stuff is ironed out, I will make it available for everyone on Steam and itch. Okay then, for the final feature this update, we go back to Tiny Glade, as you can not only change the height and slope of the mountains, you can also move them. It was when I noticed this that I finally had this light bulb moment for how to implement the #1 requested feature, play tectonics.
Sure, it required a whole new planet editor, but that was already the second most requested feature, and because I was already planning an update about movement, you can see how it nicely came together in my head.
Then, during the 1 month live stream of the Planet Ride 1B, I also really wanted to increase the distance between some of the continents so the animals could no longer swim, which took away any remaining doubt. So now we can finally do stuff like create 2 separate islands, watch life evolve independently, and then move them together to see how 2 separate ecosystems merge, like in the Great American Interchange. Or perhaps you want to create Pangea, have life evolve in one continent, only to break it apart later and see the evolution go in different directions. So with this update, it's not just the animals that can move in all kinds of interesting ways. It's the world under their feet as well. One moment you design a simple sessile animal for the deep ocean floor, next you choreograph an entire planet. The time where I couldn't work on a single project for longer than a few weeks is long gone. I've been working on this for years, and with each new update, as the game grows, so does my excitement. I really hope something about this update will move you too.
Filé, velho. Não gosto do jogo. Eu joguei já tem muito tempo.
On Sunday, Argentina went
Sapling. Evolution Simulator. Mas aí o dev blog do cara é tão top dos desafios que o cara enfrenta, como ele resolveu e como não deu tão certo, ele teve que resolver de outra forma. E as vantagens e desvantagens de cada tipo é muito interessante. O cara fazendo a música, o cara faz programação, a arte, o rolê todo, é top demais. A lot of this child. Oito. Fácil. QI. Bota no ombro da dele e leva aí. Quando voltar a barraca já foi.
Went to the polls for its congressional midterms, with roughly half of the seats in the lower house and a third of the seats in the upper house up for grabs. In what was widely seen as a make-or-break election for Argentina's embattled president Javier Milei, his Libertad Avanza party outperformed the polls, beating the left-wing Peronist bloc by 10 points and securing a fresh mandate for his radical platform of economic reform. So in this video, we're going to explain why this election was so crucial for Milei, the results, and what might happen next. So, to understand why these elections were so important for Milei, you need to understand the interplay between Milei's economic project and his political prospects. In short, the success of Milei's economic project has always relied on him remaining popular enough to convince investors and the markets that his reforms are actually going to stick. After all, even if they like Milei's policies, foreign investors aren't going to invest in Argentina and aid its economic recovery if they think Milei is just going to be replaced by another spendthrift Peronist in a couple of years' time, as usually happens in Argentina. Originally, it looked like things were going pretty well. Milei's approval ratings held high for most of his first year, and he made impressive progress balancing both Argentina's fiscal and trade deficits. This allowed him to get a fair bit of legislation through Argentina's Congress, despite the fact that the Libertad Avanza party only held about 15% of the seats in the lower chamber. And that's because opposition parties were wary of being seen to obstruct a popular and apparently effective president. There was also some hope in Milei's camp that his original success might give way to a virtuous cycle, whereby his impressive approval ratings would convince investors that his reforms would stick, who would then pour money into Argentina, driving economic growth and pushing up Milei's own popularity, etc. etc. However, in the past couple of months, the reverse has started happening, and instead of a virtuous cycle, Milei has apparently got stuck in a sort of vicious cycle. This really kicked off after a series of corruption scandals earlier in the year, which triggered a decline in Milei's approval ratings, and his party were then punished at the Buenos Aires provincial elections in early September, where they lost to the left-wing Peronists by 13 points. Worried that Milei's reforms would soon be stymied by the Peronists, foreign investors and anxious Argentinians responded by selling Argentinian assets, especially Argentina's currency, the peso. This was bad news for Milei, not least because a sharp devaluation in the peso would stoke inflation, increasing the cost of imports, undoing perhaps his most notable economic achievement, namely the stabilization of Argentina's monthly inflation rate. Now, Milei tried to stem the peso's decline by essentially hiking interest rates, but this put the brakes on Argentina's already stagnant economy, and was ultimately insufficient. When the peso continued to decline, Milei then had to go directly into bank and spend dollars buying up pesos. But this was clearly unsustainable, given Argentina's meager foreign exchange reserves. At this point, it looked like Milei was well and truly stuck in a vicious cycle, whereby his falling approval ratings were triggering market sell-offs, which were in turn undermining his economic project, thus pushing his approval ratings down even further. However, in late September,
Seis facilmente, só que eu desci só pouco,
the
não
US announced they were
desci o
essentially
full.
bailing him out by providing a $20 billion swap,
Acho que eu roubei.
which allows Argentina to convert pesos to dollars at a constant exchange rate. When this didn't stop the sell-off, the Trump administration took things a step further and literally spent hundreds of millions of dollars buying up pesos for currency. Now, both Milei and Trump have been hoping that this support would get them out of this vicious cycle by providing some economic relief ahead of the midterms. But things didn't go perfectly to plan here. Not only did the peso continue to fall, reaching a new low of about 1,500 to the dollar last week, but the fact that he needed a bailout in the first place has undermined Milei's appeal as sort of an economic savant, and instead made him look more like your typical Argentinian politician, beset by corruption scandals and economic crisis. Moreover, the Trump administration's decision to condition support on a strong showing for Milei at the midterms caused a bit of a political storm. For context, Trump basically said he'd withdraw support if Argentinians didn't vote for Milei, telling reporters earlier this month, quote, "If Milei wins, we're staying with him, and if he doesn't, we're gone. We're not going to waste our time." Unsurprisingly, this didn't go down well with the opposition, who accused the US of interfering with Argentina's internal affairs, with the Peronist leader declaring that, quote, "The Argentine economy is being managed with a remote control by the Treasury of the United States." Polls going into the election showed that Milei's lead had essentially evaporated, with both the La Libertad Avanza party and the Peronist Fuerza Patria coalition on about 37%. In the end, however, the polls were way off, and La Libertad Avanza ended up beating Fuerza Patria by about 10 points. As of Monday morning, with about 99% of the votes counted, La Libertad Avanza were on about 41%, while Fuerza Patria were on about 32%. Because it was only the midterms, only about half of the 257 seats in Argentina's lower chamber, the Chamber of Deputies, were up for grabs, as were about a third of the seats in the upper house, the Senate. Projections suggest that Milei's party won 64 seats in the Chamber of Deputies and 12 in the Senate, which would give him a total of 101 seats in the lower house and 20 in the upper. While he clearly doesn't have an outright majority, Milei now has at least a one-thirds blocking minority in the Chamber of Deputies, which essentially means that his presidential vetoes against opposition legislation cannot be overruled by a two-thirds majority in Congress. Without a majority, though, he'll still need support from opposition parties to pass legislation, but he's been pretty successful at this in the past, and his impressive performance in this election should make things easier for him. You get the idea then. Sunday's elections went pretty brilliantly for Milei, and to top it all off, because of this ongoing interplay between Milei's political prospects and his economic project, it's also been great news for the peso. While the Argentinian exchanges weren't open at the time of writing, on the crypto-based currency exchanges, where the Argentine peso trades 24 hours, the peso has strengthened about 10% against the dollar, trading at just over 1,300 to the dollar. This means that Milei should be able to just let the peso float, inflation won't surge, and he could probably start building back his foreign exchange reserves. All in all, while the best strategy was probably just to avoid the corruption scandals that caused trouble in the first place, Milei's gamble of artificially boosting the peso to give an electoral boost seems to have paid off handsomely. And this is also pretty great news for the US Treasury, which will now be able to sell its new peso holdings back for dollars without making a loss. Before you go, we've just announced our new coffee table book, Assembly Required, a 300-page book which highlights 27 of the world's most beautiful parliament buildings, from the classics like the to the US Capitol or the Hungarian capital.
Como é que eu faço essa porra tão levemente sem incentivo aí, no outro eu tô na merda sem conseguir?
For each parliament, we don't just show beautiful photos of these actually incredible buildings. We also tell you the stories behind the buildings, both through passages written by our...
Eu estou saindo da turma de vocês.
Poxa, ministro Fox, que pena.
Que notícia péssima.
Vai fazer falta. Oh, não, mas que triste. Vamos sentir saudade.
Ok, estou indo então. Tchau. Finalmente nos livramos daquele bolsonarista enrustido.
Enrustido? Bondade sua, ministro Alexandre.
Ali é mais bolsonarista que o Bolsonaro. Absurdo esses ministros com inclinação política. Olha que bonitinho que eu comprei. Vossas Excelências vêm fazer parte da segunda turma no lugar do Barroso. Selva!
Selva!
É, meu amigo, é. Expulso peruca. Vossas Excelências, estou de volta à primeira turma.
Olha, gente, que bom.
Excelente notícia. Ainda bem que o senhor voltou, fez falta.
Que felicidade.
Mas que balões são esses, Vossas Excelências? E esse bolo? Os senhores por acaso deram uma festa? Surpresa! Oh, Vossas Excelências fizeram uma festa pra mim porque eu voltei. Mas que honra!
Mas por que o bolo tá comigo?
Ah, é que o Dino não se controla, sabe como é que é, né?
Poxa, eu tô até arrependido de ter pedido pra trocar. Eu era querido e não sabia. Silva!
Que mal me pergunte, mas por que Vossa Excelência retornou, hein?
O ministro Fachin disse que a turma precisava muito de mim.
Chama sacanagem!
Isso não se faz. Ó, dá um jeito nisso. Adivinha quem voltou? Selva! Selva!
Ele tá hiperventilando.
Vamos fazer uma oração que passa. Senhor, não, da cloroquina que passa.
É, meu amigo, é.
Primeira turma, voltei! Ué, o que tem uma carranca na entrada?
É pra espantar mal olhado.
Pelo visto não funcionou.
Isso é um absurdo! Pode chamar esse bosta! Só dá um jeito nisso!
Agora...
Segunda turma, voltei!
Ih, agora deu disfonia.
A ivermectina que passa!
Olha, meu amigo.
Primeira turma, voltei! Mas o quê? A missão de Segunda turma, voltei!
Ih, deu crise do soluço.
Aplica ozônio que passa!
É, meu amigo, é.
Bom dia, Vossas Excelências! Bom dia, ministro Fux! Selva! Selva!
O que Vossa Excelência fez pra que eles se entendessem? Foi a performance demoníaca?
Claro que não. Eu falei que ia cortar a lagosta da hora do lanche.
Nossa, mas que demônio!
A segunda repetição desses aqui é onde tá aberto. Tô morto já. Não sei se eu tô melhorando, acho que eu tô descendo menos, eu tô mudando, eu tô ficando mais relagrão pra conseguir fazer. Vai me dando dor nos ligação. Acabou meu whey agora. Será que fez algum efeito?
Only a few months ago, Europe's rearmament push was dominating the headlines, with the news abuzz with stories about NATO defence spending uplifts, national militarisation drives, and hundreds of billions of euros of new debt issued by national governments and the EU via its Rearm Europe programme. However, in recent weeks, media reports have suggested that Europe's rearmament isn't going totally to plan. Some pan-European defence projects, such as France and Germany's joint fighter jet project, and the EU's drone defence initiative, are stalling due to contractor tensions and disagreements over procurement, while certain national programmes, such as Germany's proposed military service scheme, are also facing challenges due to political and public opposition. So in this video, we'll discuss why Europe's rearmament drive appears to be stalling, and how the EU is trying to get it back on track.
interested in the political alliances and groupings which shape our world, then you might enjoy our poster, Every Alliance Explained. It shows, in slightly confusing detail, all of the world's major alliances and how different countries link together. Check out the poster by clicking the link in the description. So let's get straight into it. As we see it, there are three main things hampering Europe's rearmament at the moment. First, intra-European squabbling, second, strained public finances, and third, challenges around expanding national armies. Let's start with the first and perhaps biggest problem facing Europe's rearmament, namely that European countries are still, despite the apparent urgency of the moment, struggling to cooperate on defence projects. The EU appeared to remind member states of this only last week, publishing an updated communication on its 2025 white paper for European defence, following the recent escalations in Russia's hybrid attacks on EU member states, which saw incursions of Russian drones and warplanes into European NATO airspace in September and October. In this document, which has a noticeably urgent tone, the EU states somewhat bluntly that, to be 2030 ready, Europe needs to move now. The new paper outlines plans for 4 new intra-EU flagship projects: the European Drone Defence Initiative and Eastern Flank Watch, the European Air Shield, and the European Space Shield, all to be launched in 2026 and completed by 2028 at the latest. The European Commission intends to act as a facilitator for these projects, providing a quote one-stop shop service to give advice to member states on linking national
Levantei agora a última do chão, né?
However, within days of the Commission announcing these new initiatives, intra-EU divisions have arisen. For instance, while the drone war is supported by the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Finland and Denmark, France and Germany are reportedly sceptical, because they want to handle big procurement initiatives themselves, rather than have the Commission act as a coordinator. To try and address this, the EU is pushing for 40% of all defence procurement to be joint procurement by the end of 2027, with quote lead and co-lead nations appointed on implementation plans by early 2026. But whether they can overcome opposition from individual member states remains to be seen. Similarly, recent media reports have suggested that one
Vou até a falha, mas se eu fizer isso eu não consigo me levantar. Então ele faz o levantar primeiro, né? Pra nesse aqui eu ir até a falha. Isso aí é a lógica. Fico fazendo esse primeiro. Usei o bom.
Which dates back to 2017, is now on the brink of collapse due to tensions between the two lead
Aumentar pra 10, que hoje isso é muito fácil também.
France's Dassault and Germany's Airbus. As one senior Airbus executive told journalists after the Paris Air Show in June, we are competitors that have to marry. According to The Economist, some German officials think the French see FCAS as more of an industrial trophy than a strategic necessity, while some in France suspect that the Germans just want to steal their expertise. But whatever the reason for this fallout, suggestions that both sides are prepared to walk away from one of the EU's long-standing joint defence projects is a bad sign for both French-German relations and European defence autonomy. There are also recurring disagreements over whether pan-European defence projects should be organised at the EU level, or expanded to include other nearby NATO allies like the UK and even Turkey. France, for instance, has apparently blocked the UK from the EU's new defence fund, despite the tentative rapprochement between the UK and the EU earlier this year. The second reason that Europe's rearmament is stalling is strained public finances. This apparent unwillingness to coordinate defence projects at the European level risks putting even more strain on the public finances of European countries, many of which are already dealing with tight budgets and stagnant growth, and which are now having to spend lots more on defence, with all European NATO members, other than Spain, committing in June to NATO's new spending target of 5% of GDP. However, as we've explained in previous videos, European militaries could actually get far better value for money if they coordinated more of their defence spending. Because national European armies tend to source weapons from their own domestic suppliers, European defence manufacturers aren't used to producing equipment at scale, which means the systems they do produce are more expensive. As this graphic from the Bruegel think tank, comparing the cost of various howitzers show, higher production generally corresponds to lower cost per unit, which is why American, Russian and Ukrainian-made systems are cheaper than their European equivalents. Similarly, the latest variant of Germany's Leopard tank comes in at €29 million, roughly 7 times what it costs Russia to produce a T-90 tank, and 12 times what it costs China to produce a Type 99A. The consequent fragmentation of Europe's defence industry has also led to unnecessary duplications of equipment. According to a 2018 analysis, European NATO members collectively had 6 times as many weapon systems as the US. Simplifying procurement and standardising equipment across the EU would also improve cooperation between European armies, which would likely be needed in the event of a war on the continent. It's also given way to short-term thinking on the part of European arms manufacturers, who tend to only invest when their home country is increasing defence spending. As such, the EU's updated defence white paper recommends that member states leverage their joint buying power
Mas dá pra fazer 3, tá? Dá pra fazer.
to quote, send the right long-term signals to help firms expand production. However, it will probably be difficult to get European manufacturers on board, as they've historically benefited from supplying their own domestic armies with little competition, and may initially see lower profits from joint procurement than if they kept supplying their own national armies. Anyway, the third and final obstacle blocking Europe's rearmament is that most European militaries have been getting progressively smaller, at least in terms
Se
of
você
land
progredir,
areas.
você tá fazendo menos, velho. Antigamente descia tudo, né? E a pessoa morre. Tô descendo só até aqui assim e vim
This month,
voltando.
for instance, Germany's coalition fell out over adding a lottery provision to its draft military service bill, over concerns that the proposed voluntary scheme
Mas aí agora eu
recruits.
tipo que fiz os 6, né? Fazendo, tenho que melhorar a forma agora mais na frente.
Despite huge
Mas foi isso aí por hoje.
defense spending. Sweden